Sure.
Hello and welcome to a very special interview of the series called Let a Millennial Ask. Today, I am deeply honored and privileged that I have Professor Dinyar Patel with me. Sir is an South Asian history professor at Institute of Management, Bombay. He has been a research affiliate at Harvard University. Thank you for joining me, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for having me here.
Sir has written on a remarkable book on the great old man of Indian freedom struggle, Dadabhai Naoroji. It's called Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism. Thank you so much for writing this because it is so refreshing, particularly for the young generation readers like me.
Good to know. That's very good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to sum up my comment by my favorite Ramchandra Guha that he wrote in the back of this book. This is an exemplary work of scholarship that empathetically restores Naoroji to his rightful place in the history of India, great period in the world. And I totally second this particular statement of him.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me start by asking you, sir. The subtitle of your book said Naoroji was pioneer of Indian nationalism. And it reminds me of your article written in Indian Express, to be specific, on 27th of July.
Yeah.
My question to you, A, how you come to the conclusion that Naoroji was pioneer of Indian nationalism? B, you said in that article, and I quote, India is in critical need of remembering Naoroji's brand of nationalism. Why there is a critical need, and why was Naoroji a pioneer of Indian nationalism?
Sure. With regard to the first question as to why he was a pioneer of Indian nationalism, well, he was a pioneer. There were many pioneers, of course, right? I mean, some people have traced the genesis of thought that we would now call nationalism all the way back to someone like Ram Mohan Roy. I mean, Ram Mohan Roy was, not someone fighting for independence, obviously, right? I mean, it was very different what he was fighting for, but a lot of the same thought, this what is called liberal thought, originated with a lot of what he wrote and spoke about. So there are many people who were at the very beginning. But the reason why Naoroji was a particularly important pioneer was because he played such an important role in so many aspects of early nationalism. He helped establish the Indian National Congress. He really helped shepherd it through its first few decades, along with people like Allan Octavian Hume, William Wedderburn, Rana Day, and then later on, of course, people like Gokhale and Tilak and such. And a lot of the ideas of Indian nationalism, Naoroji was the first person to really bring them to the forefront. So economic nationalism and the idea of a drain of wealth and the idea that India was poor because of British colonialism, these were ideas that were popularized by Naoroji, and he provided the scholarship that proved his point, the numbers and the data. And this, of course, was the idea that sustained Indian nationalism all the way through Gandhi and Nehru, right? I mean, they were also talking about poverty as the central feature of imperialism and the central justification for getting eventually independence from the British Empire. So that's one snippet as to why he was pioneering. And of course, there are many other aspects for why he was pioneering in terms of, his ideas on, a liberal democratic political order for India in the future, his ideas on, with particular regard to secularism and communal harmony. So one of the most important ways also that Naoroji impacted nationalism was by mentoring a whole new generation of leaders, people from Firoz Shah Mehta to Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and eventually people like Gandhi, right? I mean, when Gandhi was in South Africa in his late 20s, he was corresponding with Dadabhai Naoroji, and so Naoroji, served as in a capacity of being almost like a mentor, not as much as a mentor as Gokhale was, of course, but still an important figure. So in regard to your second question, I think, the really important reason why Naoroji's legacy needs to be rediscovered today is because the early Congress that Naoroji and others helped build was not just about, one idea and everyone else was wrong. I mean, it was what I guess what you would call a big tent. Many different ideas were allowed. It was quite democratic in a structure. It was, for its time, relatively popular, and it encouraged dissent. It looked down upon ideas of chauvinism, kind of like exclusive nationalism. The idea that one group of people is better than the other. It was quite open and quite receptive to new ideas and receptive to debate. And these are, of course, all ingredients that are increasingly coming under threat under the so-called new nationalism in India today. So, I mean, it's not just, I think, Naoroji's brand of nationalism that needs to be rediscovered, but also people like Gokhale, Ranade. I mean, even Tilak would talk with people on the other side of the fence and work with them. Tilak worked with Jinnah when Jinnah was still a liberal nationalist and before he became a adherent of the two-party, the two-state theory. So I think this early liberal heritage really needs to be rediscovered, because there is a very strong Indian tradition of tolerance, as we know, and that tolerance extended to liberal politics as well in the early 20th century, and we've somehow lost the track in the past few years.
Okay. My second question, you might think identical to the first one, but I want some reflections. Professor, I am a millennial kid of 20 years. So could you please reflect me on what are the ideals Naoroji stood for, and what are the principles, what are the values he bequeathed India with, which we millennials are supposed to take the legacy forward?
Yeah. So that it's interesting that you bring up you're 20 years old, so I'm almost twice your age. I'm starting to feel my years. But
okay.
I think Naoroji's legacy has a lot of relevance still for today. Naoroji was ultimately concerned with poverty in India, right? That was the ultimate problem in India, that India remained a poor country, and as long as India remained a poor country, you could not solve any other issue, right? I mean, freedom would be compromised, democratic politics would be compromised, good governance would be compromised. So poverty was the abiding, problem, and you had to do everything to tackle that problem. And today in 2021, obviously India is in a far better situation, right? I mean, especially in the past 1 to 3 decades, India has become much richer, right? I mean, now it's being taken quite seriously on the world stage as an economic power, but there's a long way left to go, right? A very, very long way left to go. And I find it particularly striking when a place like India is compared with China, because if you look at China's rates of poverty, they are so low in comparison to India. I mean, the average Chinese enjoys a much better quality of life, far better. You cannot compare it with between India and China, and yet India is the democracy, right? So that problem of poverty still needs to be eradicated. I mean, poverty today is different, right? 150 years ago, poverty meant that you might die of famine, depending on what happened with the weather patterns. Today, it's different. Today, the issues of malnutrition, starvation is, of course, still a problem. There's issues of basic health. So that's, that central idea of poverty still needs to really animate policy discussion. Naoroji took all political ideas and made them subservient to the central issue of poverty. Things like education, democratic politics, they were all ingredients to kind of help, eradicate poverty within the country.
Okay. Professor, there is another question from my side, and this is a very interesting one. I was very surprised by reading that Gandhiji called Dadabhai Naoroji as the father of the nation, because my generation and most of my parents' generation know that the Gandhiji is father of the nation. So Naoroji was the first person to propound the term Swaraj, which was further taken by Gandhiji and other stalwarts. Could you please give me some reflection on the kind of equations or relationship that Gandhiji and Naoroji had? And had they met ever? What are the chemistry like? What was that?
Yeah. So Naoroji was not the first person to coin the word Swaraj. We don't really know who started it. I mean, obviously you can take the term back to the time of Shivaji. Tilak was definitely using the term Swaraj by the year 1898. But the importance that Naoroji played with regard to the term is that in the year 1906, he put Swaraj into the official platform form of the Indian National Congress. And this was the first time it had ever been done, right? I mean, the Congress was not committed to Swaraj prior to Naoroji, and Naoroji came in 1906 and said, look, this is our goal. We need to make this our goal. And no one could really take it out of the agenda afterward. So, it was a really decisive moment. And of course, as you pointed out, Gandhi later on takes up this idea of Swaraj. He comes up with his book Hind Swaraj just a few years later. So in regard to the second part of your question about Gandhi and Naoroji, the unfortunate answer is we don't know that much. one of the difficulties in writing history is that so much material has been lost, and so much material we cannot recover, right? I mean, so the conversations that Naoroji had with Gandhi, we don't know what they are, right? Because, once the two people died, we have no living memory of that. So it's difficult to put together what has disappeared. But we do know that, so Gandhi first approached Naoroji, I can't remember the precise year, either 1893 or 1894, when Gandhi was in Durban. Basically Gandhi said, look, I'm now in Natal. I'm working on behalf of the Indian community in South Africa. You, Dadabhai Naoroji, have just been elected to the British Parliament. Can you help me and mentor me and provide guidance, just as a father would guide a son? He used that term. So for the next for the next maybe 10, 12 years, whenever Gandhi would want to broadcast something that's going on in South Africa to people in London, and the government officials and the media and such, he would go through Naoroji. He would write a letter to Naoroji saying, "This is happening. Can you please inform the secretary of the colonial secretary, or members of the media?" And Dadabhai Naoroji would act as kind of his megaphone, if you will. So he'd broadcast a lot of the the particular issues that Gandhi wanted to bring up. They did meet. Yeah, exactly. At this point, and the two men did meet each other on a few other occasions. I mean, in 1906, Gandhi came to London, and Dadabhai Naoroji met him and took him to meet various important officials. And at that meeting, apparently, Gandhi remarked on how he went to Dadabhai Naoroji's office, and he says the office is really tiny. You can barely fit 2 chairs in it, and yet here's this man who's 80 years old working away, writing out all his letters by hand, stacks of papers and books everywhere. This is not someone who's slowing down. So he was quite impressed by that. And then when Gandhi came back to India in 1915, when he landed in Bombay, one of the first people he met was Dadabhai Naoroji, and Naoroji was. He was almost 90 at this point. So, it would have been very difficult for him to meet with anyone. But, he made sure that Naoroji was one of the first people that he met when he returned.
All right. Okay. So my next question to you, the second last question. When Naoroji entered into British Parliament in 1892, if my memory serves me correctly, for him, I want to just 3 parts. A, how he got elected, what was the journey he got elected, how the Westminster played out in his life for him, and particularly why he got dismayed at the end.
Yeah, good. All good questions. He won election in 1892 from a constituency called Central Finsbury, which is in the center of London, it was as much a surprise to people back then as it is now. How could an Indian get elected to the British Parliament? He did so by cultivating a lot of allies. People who were liberal or progressive in Great Britain, he reached out to them and he said, "I will support you if you will support me." So he reached out to Irish people who lived in that part of London. And Ireland at the time was a part of the British Empire, but it was struggling for its own type of home rule. There's a lot of conversation between Irish and Indians. Annie Besant was, of course, one fantastic example. And they were discussing the same ideas. Why are our countries so poor? Why do we have famines? Why can't we get home rule? So Naoroji found very close allies amongst the Irish. And a lot of these Irish people who were voters in his constituency voted for him. Another group were members of trade unions and workers. Naoroji supported trade unionism. He supported the rights of workers. So they were some of his strongest allies. Another group was women. Women did not have the right to vote, of course, in 1892. They don't get that right until the 1920s in Great Britain. Yeah, it depends on who you were. By 1928, pretty much all women in Britain can vote. So it's a long time. But these women could go house to house and try to convince people to vote for Naoroji, or they could try to convince their husbands, fathers, and brothers. So that's one way which he got elected. And also he was a convincing person. He was able to study local conditions and talk about how he would help locals, and he did during his term in Parliament. So the second part of your question, you were asking about how Westminster was a part of his life and his strategy. So the reason why Naoroji wanted to stand for Parliament in the first place was because he realized it would be very difficult to get any type of change in India. The government in India was just too conservative, it was reluctant to change. In Parliament, you could actually make some laws that could change the Indian government. You could go over their head and make some reform. And he tried to do that, but as you point out, he ended up being very disillusioned because ultimately all his efforts failed. He tried to reform the Indian civil service, and he actually got a victory when Parliament voted in favor of a resolution for changing how the civil service operated, but the government just ignored that decision. So increasingly, Naoroji found himself just completely ignored, even when some people supported him, or even when he knew he was right. And that's why he got disillusioned. I mean, he realized that you had to do much more than just campaign in India. In Great Britain, especially in Parliament. You had to back it up with a, organization on the ground, both in the United Kingdom amongst the people, and of course in India amongst the people as well.
Oh, so the lobbying was not there as Naoroji expected.
It was much more difficult to convince people, I think, in Parliament than Naoroji thought. Naoroji thought, if he put a solid case before Parliament and he showed why this was right and it would actually help British people as well as Indians, people would be convinced. And most people were not. They just didn't care in the first place.
Okay. Professor, you spent 15 or 10 years, I mean, just 50% or 70% of my entire life in writing, researching about this book. And you encountered, and I was, if my facts serves me correctly, 15,000 documents in researching about this book. Can you give me some anecdotes about how your journey, how the book was shaped? I'm very curious to know how this book came out.
Yeah. So, the book took about 10 years, from the start of research until it finally came out. I started really working on it in 2010, 2011. And, whenever you work on a big historical topic, you have to go to the archives, right? And luckily, the National Archives of India are, they have fantastic collections. The condition is not always very good, but the collections are, quite remarkable, the material they have. So when I went to the National Archives, there was one room on, I think, the third floor or the fourth floor, which had collections of various individuals. So, Gokhale, Naoroji, Rajendra Prasad, Gandhiji, lots of other figures, right? So I looked at Naoroji's papers and I didn't know how many papers they were. So I got there and only then I discovered, there are 30,000 documents. How am I going to look through all of this? But the only way to do it is just to start, right? Just, start, read some stuff. And the more you read and the more work you put in, the easier it gets. So, it came to a point for me where I could go through several hundred files in a day because I knew what the pattern would be like. I knew how to identify what would be important, what might not be important. And it was great fun because this was the first time anyone was looking at a majority of these letters. And, reading someone's correspondence from 120, 130 years ago, it's fascinating because you read about how their lives are like. I found all sorts of completely crazy stuff like receipts for, his shoes or his eyeglass prescriptions or, junk mail or letters from friends or, items that were sent from all parts of the world. So it was a great deal of fun. And, I had to actually kind of take myself out of the archive. Otherwise, I would have just spent too much time doing more research. So that was really the most fun aspect of writing the book.
Okay, Professor, before I wrap up this interview, this was a question not my plan, but I was suddenly curiosity to ask you. What are the major, I should say figures, what are the major incidents you think that young researchers, or I'm a journalist, so actually journalism student, so young researchers should focus on like the last biography written on Naoroji was in 1939.
Yeah.
So the last how many more figures are there?
Yeah. I mean, there were some biographies after that, but the last really comprehensive biography of Naoroji was written in 1939. There are lots of figures. I mean, this is the exciting thing about Indian history. There are so many figures who have been forgotten. So, Gokhale, I think, is a very relevant figure nowadays, just because he was a very liberal, tolerant, progressive person. And I think there needs to be a lot more work on him. Ranade, of course, was a fascinating figure as well. Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai. These are all people who deserve much more scholarship than they have currently. But there are a whole host of people who are lesser known who deserve a good amount of work as well, especially women leaders. When we read Indian history, most of the time it's just men, right? And it's mostly upper caste men. And there's so many people who are fascinating, who deserve better studies. Savitribai Phule is someone who has a absolutely fascinating life, right? I mean, she educates lower caste people. She ends up, unfortunately, dying of plague because she was working in the plague epidemic. I mean, absolutely heroic figure. And, it'd probably be very difficult to reconstruct her life, but we need to make it happen. Other people like Vijay Lakshmi Pandit or Sarojini Naidu or Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, these are all, amazing, really heroic and brave women who deserve studies. And luckily, I do know one or two people who are planning to write books on her. So on at least Kamala Devi and Sarojini Naidu. So I think you'll start to find more material. But there's so many people in Indian history who are relatively forgotten, who deserve to be unearthed, and their stories deserve to have to be shown the light of day. So the answer I can give is just dive in there, and you'll find someone very quickly who's worth investigating.
Thank you for this cherry on the top answer, and I'm deeply thankful. And I hope my amateur questions made some sense to you. Thank you so much.
Don't say amateur questions. Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Same from my side. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.